Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. With that introduction, you will have noticed one thing which is glaringly conspicuously absent, and that is an experience in e-waste management. And when I was asked to do this keynote, I was nervous that I'd struggle to think of something sensible to say to take 10 or 15 minutes. But once I started studying it, researching it, and thinking about the issue, the ideas just bubbled up, and I fear I might overextend my 30-minute welcome. I trust you will forgive me for that in advance. So thank you for this opportunity to be part of this critical dialogue on the treatment of e-waste, because e-waste and how we deal with it lies at the nexus, and this is what I found interesting, at the nexus of several of the most topical and important topics on the business agenda today. The environment, good governance, financial sustainability, innovation, social responsibility, at least. There's probably more. So what I'm going to try and do in my address is reflect on these issues as a scholar and a practitioner of these issues in the general sense, not as an e-waste industry expert. I'm pretty sure you guys in the room know more about the specifics than I ever will. But hopefully my observations as a relative outsider will offer some value by offering a different perspective which is not constrained by your pressing concerns of today. And hopefully I'll be able in a way to reflect the wood more than the trees. So this is really important because we all know that the volume of e-waste produced globally is growing alarmingly. We all know that efforts to collect and recycle or responsibly dispose of it are nascent, or dare I say woefully inadequate here and abroad. And we all know that the environmental consequences of a failure to address it are extremely harmful. Let me give some analogies of the consequences of failure. The petrochemical industry has brought enormous economic and social benefit to humanity. We are mobile. We have materials to fabricate incredible products and machines, and it's a major driver of manufacturing, job creation, economic development, and it offers essential raw materials for countless industries from healthcare to agriculture and electronics, impacting nearly every aspect of our lives. So it does do a whole lot of good. But at the same time, the petrochemical industry significantly impacts the environment through greenhouse gas emissions, air pollution, waste generation, which contribute to climate change, health issues, and so on. And the harmful things it emits, like methane and nitrogen oxide, exacerbate smog, the ozone formation, and also waste management practices contaminate groundwater. Quite a lot of this, I'm sure, sounds familiar to you guys. Let me give another example from a completely different environment, one closer to my background. Social media. When Mark Zuckerberg founded Facebook in 2004, his stated goal was to enable people to connect with family, with friends, with colleagues, and through connecting to fulfill one of the base needs of humanity. Social media and the freedom of expression it brought has indeed brought immense social benefits, from in some cases stimulating and enabling democratic processes, fostering inclusion and belonging, especially in marginalized groups. Not to mention the simple pleasure and convenience of connecting with family and friends and colleagues. But at the same time, it's brought a lot of negative consequences, propagating hate speech, abuse, bullying, aiding the dissemination of misinformation and fake news, conspiracy theories, enabling extremism, driving alienation and exclusion, creating digital addictions. So not to mention all these issues around data privacy and monopolistic practices by the big players in social media. So in other words, something that was intended to be really good and enhance the human condition and promote human flourishing has ended up with negative social consequences which threaten to outweigh and completely invalidate all the benefits that it created. So again, some of this might sound familiar. So the key point is that electrical and electronic goods generate incredible economic and social benefit. But if as an industry we are blind to and neglectful of the adverse social and environmental consequences of that industry, we too may stand accused of being guilty and neglectful of our duty of care to society and our planet, and not respecting the legitimate expectations of our stakeholder communities to conduct ourselves in a responsible manner, mindful of our current and future impact across the spectrum of our shareholders. So if we are serious about finding optimum positions across these dimensions of economic sustainability, shareholder returns, environmental responsibility, community involvement and respect, good, accountable governance, purpose-led innovation, then our path to the future needs to aim for both some qualitative and some quantitative destinations. The quantitative things we should be looking for is clearly, firstly, ideally, a reduction in the amount of e-waste produced, or at least as a minimum, a slowdown of the increase in the amount produced, and reduction of especially the hazardous materials in that e-waste. Globally, I believe, we produce 65 million tons of e-waste a year, and that's growing. And we should agree how we, and this is a global conversation, clearly not just a South African one, how we approach that. In South Africa, I understand the number is 360,000 tons, and that's the recorded number. Who knows what the actual number is? Secondly, we need to consider that a greater percentage of the e-waste is collected. Globally, it stands at 22%, I believe. In the European Union, which seems to represent best practice, it stands at 43%. In South Africa, our current estimates are less than 5%. Which probably overstates reality due to the invisible production and grey imports. So surely this needs to at least double in the short term. How can we be at less than 5% and best practice is at 45%? And get to a majority of e-waste produced being collected in the medium to long term. And then we also quantitatively, I think it's important that we get a better handle on the coverage of all of our production and imports. And I'll speak to this later, eliminating blind spots, grey imports in our processes. So that would be some quantitative things we need to aim for. But the destination also needs to include, and this is where I'm going to be focusing on the rest of the speech, is the qualitative structural descriptions. Firstly, we should strive for a sustainable architecture which has a few features: affordability, fairness, aligned to the desired outcomes, efficiency and effectiveness, and providing the bang for the buck in terms of funding provided. Secondly, we need a model supported by systems and practices which gives all stakeholders the assurance that things are working as intended, and which is verifiable and transparent. Thirdly, we need a framework which provides for compliance management and enforcement, and an ecosystem capacitated to effect this. Fourthly, we need a way of governing the players in the ecosystem, especially the PROs, the producer responsibility organizations, which improves their transparency, legitimacy, promotes shared ownership of the outcomes, accountability, discourages opportunism, and ensures balance and fairness and trust. A lot of words there, and I'll speak to some of those points later. And finally, we do need, in particular, a ubiquitous collection and logistics system, which is known and embraced by consumers, which is efficient and supports all the aforementioned goals. And I'm sure the impartial amongst us would actually agree that that's a good set of aspirations to aim for. So briefly, the ground I'm going to cover is I'm going to focus in, and the majority of what I talk about will be what I call 5 crucial conversations, touching on the points I've introduced. Then I'll present some very selected personal suggestions to move towards those. And finally, I'll wrap up with some concluding remarks. I think it is important that I clarify my departure position. My sense is that for pragmatic reasons, it's best to use the current status quo of the industry, warts and all, as my departure point. That's not to say that the system of today is cast in stone, nor that if we could start again, this is what we should be. But it seems to me unproductive to depart from a point which isn't based on today's reality. So today's reality is my departure point. So in that sense, I take the high-level industry structure of today as that departure point. Namely, the producers of e-waste are ultimately accountable for its responsible disposal. They pay for this. The disposal process, though, is managed by the PROs, who are accountable to ensure that collection mechanisms are in place, that they're effective, that waste is recycled where possible and disposed of responsibly by the waste providers. They collect the fees from the producers, they disperse them to the other system participants, and the other players, like the waste pickers, the logistics partners, the waste treatment and disposal partners, are part of that ecosystem. Importantly, my understanding is that government monitors the system in primarily a light touch, low intervention manner for now, and we'll talk about that. So let's move on to the 5 crucial conversations, and Jonathan touched on these in his introduction for the day, well, certainly on many of them. The first crucial conversation, and you'll see a crucial conversation is something where there's opposing opinions, where there's strong emotions, high stakes, and I think all 5 of these conversations I'm going to put on the table meet those requirements. So the first one is about the funding model and the structure for this. And before we talk about the model, I think there's two principles to anchor the conversation. The first is, the producer pays. The only alternative to producer pays is for consumers to pay for the disposal of their e-waste. This could be by means of a levy when they buy the product, something like VAT. Or it could be a general levy like a municipal fee for waste collection, refuse collection. Or it could be a fee that we specifically pay the disposers to actually look after our e-waste. In my opinion, a levy on the purchase is never going to happen in a market where even a 0.5% increase proposal in VAT nearly collapsed the government of national unity. B, namely a general levy on municipal fees like refuse collection, I think is a complete non-starter because of the administrative impossibility of preventing these fees from vanishing into the morass of local government ineffectiveness. C, that we as consumers pay for the disposal of our e-waste is the best possible way we could think of to disincentivize consumers from actually embracing their responsibilities in the e-waste value chain. So regrettably, you could say, unpopular as though it may be, the only viable option is producer pays. So having laid that cornerstone, there's another reality we need to anchor. At the moment, we only collect less than 5% of our e-waste in South Africa, as I understand it. Maybe the number's different, but it's a small number. Fees need to be sufficient to cover the costs of collection and disposal, as well as the oversight and the assurance and the verification thereof. As we collect more e-waste, as the proportion of e-waste that gets produced does get disposed of, it's inevitable that the costs of doing that will increase. So aggregate fees will need to increase. This is inescapable. If we want to see more e-waste responsibly disposed of, aggregate fees will increase. But that doesn't mean that those currently paying producers don't have legitimate concerns in the fee model. So let's talk about some of those legitimate concerns. The model needs to be fair. It needs to be fair across different categories of e-waste, recognizing that mass is not possibly the sole determinant of environmental damage. It needs to be fair, treating all producers of e-waste equitably, not necessarily equally, but equitably. It needs to be fair, placing the burden not entirely on the shoulders of the early adopters and those who play by the rules. In fact, it should encourage early participation by progressive rewards for doing so. And it needs to be fair in the sense of no taxation without representation. Producers need to have a great say in the governance of the ecosystem. The second legitimate concern around the fee model is that it needs to be aligned with the desired outcomes. It should intrinsically encourage the behaviors that we seek to see, including reduced volume of e-waste produced, reduced content of harmful and hazardous materials, higher recycling, higher collection rates, better disposal practices, and verification, all of the above. So as we refine the model, we need to make sure that any structure, and particularly a fee structure, needs to be aligned with the outcomes that you are trying to achieve with that fee model. A third area of concern and conversation needs to be about exemptions and exceptions and allowances and incentives, because to achieve fairness and behavior alignment, these things, fee exemptions and exceptions and allowances, are almost inevitable. But then any exceptions or exemptions need to be robustly tested against serving particular interest groups or self-serving interests. And they need to take long-run impacts into account, not just short-run impacts. And they need to recognize that if any system can be gamed, it will be gamed. So we need to be very careful with exemptions and exceptions and allowances. A fourth area, sorry, I seem to have jumped ahead, is clearly affordability. Ultimately, the fee structure needs to be affordable to be sustainable. It shouldn't discourage investment by global partners. It shouldn't promote non-compliance or evasion. It can't punish those who play by the rules and advantage the unscrupulous or scurrilous. So how then do I square this off with my earlier point that e-waste costs money, producers have to pay, and that in aggregate, these aggregate costs will increase? And I think the answer lies in the 3 points you see in that call-out box. Firstly, it's about ensuring that the system delivers good bang for its buck, and that the fees collected are paid and allocated optimally to achieve the desired outcomes. Secondly, it is about the capacity of the PROs, which aren't in themselves standalone businesses. They're really services organizations which facilitate a process on behalf of the ecosystem. So it's utterly imperative for the PROs to collaborate on shared infrastructure, pooling of resources, and collaborative effort to collectively minimize costs and to stop costs from growing linearly and proportionally with volume, and really strive to achieve economies of scale. And thirdly, of course, it requires everybody to play by the rules. And this playing by the rules brings me to the second crucial conversation. How do we give all stakeholders the assurance that things are working as intended, and to do so in a way which is verifiable and transparent? Well, firstly, for a start, this clearly requires reliable, credible, sufficiently complete data on where e-products are entering the economy, by which routes, where they are consumed, and it would be impossible to ensure the universal application of the fee structure, non-evasion, fair participation and contributions, and track progress if we don't have this sort of data. I'll speak more on that later. The second issue is about greenwashing, which of course across different categories of environmental management has become a real concern. In e-waste, the essence of greenwashing, of course, is providing the appearance of collection and recycling without delivering the substance. Like, for example, spending money on endorsements or e-waste days, or showcasing unsustainable practices and performing stunts, but doing so in a way that's not scalable or sustainable. They make us look good for a while, but doesn't really move the dial. So assurance and verification is also essential to counter greenwashing by the ecosystem. The third area is anti-abuse. As I mentioned earlier, any system or process that can be exploited or manipulated for selfish gain will be. Unfortunately, it seems to be human nature. All systems get gamed, and perhaps in South Africa this is a particular challenge. So assurance and verification of e-waste claims, data records, and practices is a vital part of countering abuse and gaming the system of our e-waste architecture. There we go. The preceding points of greenwashing and anti-gaming inevitably lead us to the need for credible, trusted, and hence audible records of collections and disposals. This, as I understand, is currently self-assured and self-verified, which doesn't really give great comfort of the integrity and the veracity of the records provided. So the need for a shared track and trace system with the associated digital recording, reporting, and verification infrastructure can't really be overestimated. The final point I'd like to make in terms of assurance and verification is that the proceedings of observations on the slide all talk to the credibility of our information. And credibility requires that the assurance is substantively independent. Self-assurance is good. Self-assurance backed up by independent verification is better. And the Americans in their foreign policy practices have this term that trust is fine, trust and verify is better. So this requires the establishment of an independent verification system or body, or that alternatively that all the players are equally represented and control of a common verification system. Whatever the case, we need one system that everyone trusts and buys into. So the track and trace system needs to be a shared industry system, not only for efficiency and universality, but for credibility also. Which brings me to the third crucial conversation, which is compliance. Because it's one thing to be able to see where things are working well and where they aren't, where some players are playing by the rules and others aren't. But ultimately, we need to be able to enforce compliance. Bad actors need to be identified and dealt with. So our third crucial conversation is about how we enforce compliance. And this brings a number of sub-questions into play. The first is, how do we deal with grey market operators, which are a reality in South Africa? Clearly, it's not okay for legitimized market participants to be held to account for the disposal of their e-waste when opportunistic, frequently illegal players are providing e-products, producing e-waste, but with no obligation to deal with it. The problem, of course, goes beyond e-waste. It speaks to the integrity and effectiveness of the South African economy as a whole and the institutions which govern it. But in the context of e-waste, particular attention is required, and an industry-level approach to dealing with it is important. So what can be the consequences for people who create e-waste without even acknowledging that they exist and bringing them into the regulated economy? Dealing with grey areas and grey market practices is a bigger issue, but it is critical to the e-waste conversation. The second is, how do we deal with the ambiguous accountability of direct user imports? So when international producers sell direct to in-country users, usually in business-to-business transactions, who's accountable to firstly identify these parties and the consumption, and secondly to hold them accountable for the costs for the treatment of this e-waste? So for example, when a global telecommunications OEM provides equipment to a local telco, who's responsible for that e-waste and who pays for its disposal? When a global computer manufacturer sells computers to South African businesses directly, likewise, who is responsible for that e-waste and who pays for its disposal? These are questions that need to be answered, and they have opposing opinions, strong emotions, and high stakes. A third issue is, so what then can and should and are the penalties be for non-compliance? Are they fit for purpose? Are they actually applied? Whose job is it to do this? And those whose job it is, are they adequately capacitated? Have there actually been any prosecutions for non-compliance? Have they been visible? Do they set the correct example? On the setting the correct example, it's often said that what we call consequence management can have several purposes and shapes. It can be rehabilitative, to help the offender not offend again. It can be retributive, to essentially extract revenge or punishment on the perpetrator, which, by the way, is seldom of value. It can be restorative, to restore the ex ante situation and recompense the victim for the consequences of that offense. It can also be a deterrent, to discourage others from offending by making public the consequences of the offense. And it can also ultimately what's called decapacitative, or decapacitating in the legal fraternity. In other words, to make it not possible, incapacitate the offender from repeating the offense. In the criminal sense, usually by locking them up. So the question when we deal with e-waste offenders, are we doing so, which is a deterrent? And are we doing so, when necessary, in a way which incapacitates repeat offenders? The final aspect in terms of compliance that I'd like to raise, and very briefly, is how do we monitor self-regulation? If an industry is responsible for self-regulating itself, particularly in relation to compliance enforcement, how do we monitor and sanction non-compliance? How do industry players sanction each other? How do they sanction grey operators or foreign OEMs that don't play by the rules? Who sanctions the PROs? I'm going to come back to this point in a short while. The fourth crucial conversation, which I suspect is going to be particularly controversial, is the governance of the PROs themselves. And on that, the first point I'd like to talk to is the board structures. In the current setup, the board structures, I understand, comprise the representatives of the industries they serve. And up to a point, this makes a lot of sense, because ultimately, after all, it's those industry players who are funding the PRO. But does this provide sufficient representation across the spectrum of stakeholders affected by the e-waste? In my opinion, this practice is a bit like listed companies' boards comprising only representatives of the investors in that company. We all know, and it's common cause now, that this isn't good practice from a governance perspective. It exposes the firm to very significant jeopardy in terms of both its broader stakeholder obligations as well as the implicit social contracts with the communities that give it a license to operate. So listed firms' boards are now required to comprise a majority of independent directors. Even state-owned companies have now acknowledged the need for director independence. Look no further than the recently established boards of the National Transmission Company, on which I serve, and the National Ports Authority. So I'd put it to this audience that increasing the representativity of the boards of the PROs is necessary, but it will also bring benefits of additional skills, diverse opinions, better decisions, reduced potential for board capture, and especially in terms of market and stakeholder credibility. Admittedly, this might bring an additional management burden, but as industry has discovered, this is well worth the price of paying. The second issue I'd like to discuss in terms of the governance of the PROs is it's one thing to have better governance of the PROs through their board structure, but what also about the governance across PROs? Because surely the problem is even one bad example will make the whole system suffer and damage the credibility of the whole system. So to preserve the credibility of the overall system and manage ecosystem risk, is there a need for macro-level oversight and governance? And the conversation around the governance of PROs therefore also needs to explore the possibility of governance across PROs. Is any required? If so, what beneficial outcomes are expected or what risks are mitigated? And if there are benefits to be had by coordinating governance across PROs, and I would suggest in terms of systemic risk there are, what is the appropriate mechanism or structure? Should it be government? Irrespective of whether it's government or an industry body, its mandate would need to be clearly defined and its capacity required would need to be clearly understood. Which brings us to the fifth and final crucial conversation. And that's about the universality and efficiency of the collection infrastructure. So far, we've spoken about the enabling constructs, fees, oversight, compliance enforcement, governance. But what about actually getting the job done? So this fifth crucial conversation is about the collection infrastructure. Or perhaps maybe to be more precise, the current inadequacy of this as we speak here today. If we are serious about making real progress in the management and disposal of our e-waste, arguably the critical constraint at the moment is the collection infrastructure. One which is universal, convenient, efficient, and has integrity. If my clicker, there we go. Universal, so that it reaches the majority of e-waste produced. convenient for consumers so that it's practical and hassle-free for them to use it. Efficient so that it can deal with the volumes to which we aspire within the constraints of our resources. And has integrity so that there's no leakage and facilitates assurance and verification. In my mind, this unavoidably implies sharing of infrastructure. And another critical success factor here is the consumer awareness of the availability of the infrastructure. This will be better served if, if there's a single ubiquitous infrastructure which all consumers can access, rather than multiple overlapping but disconnected ones. And I am heartened to say that I hear that yesterday, on day one of the event, there was a full session on beginning to patch together an integrated, universal, collaborative collection model. So that's our 5 crucial conversations. But what about getting better? And I believe that convergence of ideas on these 5 crucial conversations is important to move the discourse forward towards the the goals that I shared earlier. But you might counter that I've actually so far posed more questions than provided answers. Up to a point, I make no apology for this, because it's often said that asking the right questions is more important than offering premature solutions. And as an industry outsider, I would be hesitant to offer premature solutions. And hopefully I have posed some of the right questions which you are grappling with through forums such as this, and we need to continue to grapple with. But at the risk of offering solutions which are premature and insufficiently tested, I will offer 2 ideas. I think you'd be disappointed if I offered nothing, right? And the first does talk about industry structure and regulation. In my view, there's no doubt that the ecosystem, the industry as a whole, needs enforcement capacity. It will be in everyone's, that will be in everyone's interest, especially that of the producers who are currently playing by the rules and paying for it. Better enforcement and capacity to do that will benefit them particularly. And ultimately, I'm sure the cost of any enforcement capacity would be more than returned by the greater sharing of the cost of compliance by drawing other industry players into being contributors to the system. The enforcement capacity could be industry-based, and I've got a really uncomfortable example here, which most of you won't like. But for example, AfriForum Private Prosecutions Unit. You might detest the idea of it, but that is where a particular interest group has established its own enforcement capacity. It is not inconceivable that for higher motives, let's put it that way, that the e-waste industry could do the same. More likely, though, it could and should be some form of partnership with government. And the second thought in relation to industry structure and regulation does talk about this notion of PRO rationalization. Should there be a single PRO per category, or is the current system of multiple PROs correct? It seems to me we are approaching a fork in the road. Either we improved and amend the current multiple PRO model, or whether we like it or not, a single PRO may be prescribed on us per category. People look at Singapore, who many observers believe to be a leader in this area, and say that they're doing this, so perhaps we should consider it as well. So is it a good answer for South Africa? I don't have a particular opinion on that. Perhaps, perhaps not. But I do think we need to explore the merits without preconceptions or self-interested bias. Closer to home and where I am comfortable is the role of digital and AI. Because they are transformed, digital and AI are transforming every industry. And there's no reason that our industry, the e-waste industry, should be any exception. On the contrary, my sense is that there are several opportunities which are proverbially crying out for effective use of digital and AI technologies. And the first of those relates to our data infrastructure. Where are e-waste, e-products entering the economy? By which routes? What categories are produced? In what volumes? Where are they consumed? What e-waste do they generate? What of that is collected and what of it is disposed of? This is not a future ask. Current AI and data analytics technologies can help us make great progress in establishing this fact base and keeping it dynamically current. And I think this is absolutely vital for good management information of the industry, for verification and for compliance oversight. And I think there was a session yesterday afternoon where collaboration was proposed for an AI-driven digital infrastructure with the goal of a system in 2 years. I can only applaud this, but it is absolutely critical in my view that the data about the industry is improved through an AI big data enabled system. The second, of course, which I touched on earlier, is a universal, auditable, transparent e-waste track and trace system. I mean, we all know what it entails, quite simply barcode or QR code or whatever the e-waste at the point and time of collection, timestamp it, geolocate it, overlay audit trail functionality, and track it through to final disposal. This isn't rocket science. It's based on the technologies of today, not of tomorrow. To a large degree, most of those already exist and are in place based on well-established systems. But it really just needs that we cobble it all together effectively and adopt it consistently. So, as I mentioned, this is more than a fifth. You'll see the ideas bubbled up, and I quickly got to my 30-minute time limit. So let me conclude with 3 points of summary. The first is the importance of collaboration, or the crucial conversations that I alluded to, and to the 2 specific suggestions I've just put forward, all rely on industry collaboration. None of them are single-player activities. My sense is that making progress in e-waste management in South Africa is a team sport. Yes, the industry players are competitors, but in the context of being responsible about our e-waste, we need to park our individual competitor mindsets and embrace collaboration. Globally, we see that environmental sustainability initiatives of all kinds are collaborative endeavors. Recently, this notion of a coalition of the willing found resonance in a very different context. But I think in South Africa, e-waste progress will depend on a successful, bold, innovative, assertive coalition of the willing. Producers, PROs, waste pickers, collectors, recyclers, government, and especially consumers. The second point I want to raise, and just to bring this to a point of closure, I'm not a fan of bureaucracy or bloated governance and oversight structures. But I have learned over the years that a certain way to ensure that nothing happens is to not capacitate initiatives with dedicated, capable people who you hold accountable for the outcomes. And I'm convinced that proper capacitation of the key industry level priorities is imperative. This capacitation, whether it's real or virtual, and the structures are real or virtual, it must be lean, it must be frugal, it must have precisely focused mandates. But institutional capacity will be vital to the success of this endeavor. The third area that I want to talk about is the importance of self-regulation. As I mentioned at the beginning, at the moment government is involved in a mainly light touch, low intervention manner for now. And as a long-time businessman, although I'm an academic now, I spent 35 years in industry. I think that's the appropriate approach. And I'm sure many in the room would prefer the private sector to be left to get on with doing what business does, innovating, finding solutions, creating wealth, creating jobs. Regulation is best reserved for when markets fail. Therefore, I say, make sure the market doesn't fail. If the industry fails by not taking proper responsibility for the downstream effects of what it does, the social and environmental consequences of its actions and its products and its profits, the government will argue that it has no choice but to step in. And actually, I would agree with them. Industry simply has to display a desire and to demonstrate progressive action towards taking more responsibility and ownership of the endeavor. It needs to collaborate, it needs to self-regulate, it needs to self-enforce. Quite simply, industry must manage its own problems, otherwise government will. So, ladies and gentlemen, I've covered a lot of ground. Hopefully I have asked some of the right questions. Hopefully my contributions, although they are of an unexpert outsider, can contribute to the vibrant discourse amongst you, the experts on these challenges, to make real progress. The challenges aren't trivial, but succeeding is critical for our industry, for our businesses now, but as well as broader society now and those who come after us. The point being is answers aren't simple and they aren't obvious, otherwise they'd have been done already. I'm sure they will be difficult and occasionally painful to implement. But I leave you with the words of the father of our nation. He once said, "It always seems impossible until it's done." And I'm convinced that with the right spirit of collaboration, with the capacitation of critical initiatives, the right investment in the key technological enablers, and the establishment of a common universal collection system, it might seem impossible, but it can be done. Thank you for the opportunity to address you and for your attention.